So welcome. I believe this is the 17th annual Great Writers, Great Readings season. This isn't the first reading of the season. It's the last reading of the semester, I believe. Athleen, you might correct me on that, or Athleen or Carol. But in the spring, there are other readers. You can just go online and see who else is reading. I will tell you that the poet Major Jackson will be reading in April. We don't have the exact date yet, but he's definitely reading April 2021, and it will be a remote reading, a Zoom reading, sadly, but he's such a good reader. I think he'll feel very present. So welcome to all of you. The only instruction I'm giving you is that after I introduce Linda and Linda begins to read, or just before she begins to read, I'd like you to put yourself on the speaker view, or if you want, you can turn your video off to simulate a theater so that really the attention is only on the author, and that we're not distracted by looking at each other's wonderful faces. However, the house lights will go up once Linda finishes reading and begins taking questions from the audience. Linda will, of course, want to see your faces when you ask questions. So put yourself on whatever that other view is called, gallery view, once Linda finishes her reading, which I am now introducing. I suppose you know who I am, but if you don't, I'm Phyllis Levin. I'm a professor of English at Hofstra University and the poet in residence. First, I'm just going to read a brief biographical note of Linda Gregerson, whom a good number of graduate and undergraduate students got to know in a conversation that started at 5 o'clock today and ended actually after 6 p.m. because there were so many luscious questions people had for Linda, who answered so generously and eloquently. Linda Gregerson is the author of 6 collections of poetry, most recently Prodigal, New and Selected Poems. Hope Mifflin Harcourt is the publisher. That was published in 2015. Among her earlier books, Magnetic North, published in 2007, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Waterborne, published in 2002, won the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. The Woman Who Died in Her Sleep was a finalist for both the Lenore Marshall Award and the Poets Prize. She has also received awards from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Poetry Society of America, the Modern Poetry Association, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Gregerson's books of literary criticism include The Reformation of the Subject, Spencer, Milton, and the English Protestant Epic, and Negative Capability, Contemporary American Poetry. If there's a poet capable of negative capability, it is Linda Gregerson. Gregerson teaches at the University of Michigan as Distinguished University Professor of English and Creative Writing, and is also a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. On what does our earthly joy depend? That's one of the questions Linda Gregerson's work poses. By exposing the teeming bounty that lives within us and around us in realms microscopic and colossal. And how do love and death undo us, reform us? In whatever way she experiments with diction, tone, structure, stanza, each of Gregerson's lines is a performed action, an action setting forces in motion. Sometimes the pattern on the page resembles a scaffold. And though over time she has changed her style and focus of attention, her voice by turns gregarious and enigmatic, her syntax is always sinuous, as sensuous as it is severe, unpredictable in how it ranges and where. To encounter one of her poems is to face a multi-hinged creature, opening and closing, opening and closing, complete in its aesthetic aim, unending in its implication, fully formed, ever changing. Reading Gregerson, we hear the contemporary lingo of overheard speech rub against the language of historical report, or a scientific fact at home beside an utterance intuiting knowledge of the sublime. This cut and splice montage-like approach is no mere special effect, but a symptom of Gregerson's radical inclusiveness, the signature of an author who embraces the richest variety of speech and character, a Shakespearean ambition. But more than any other writer, I find in Gregerson a kinship with John Milton, whom she channels to this day in the grandeur and dignity of her syntax, and in the simultaneous tempering and expanding of a dramatic impulse, the desire to encompass epic, tragedy, and lyric in the body of one poem. Though classical in her pose, she is Baroque in her technique of shaping a poem, allowing it to grow beyond itself. She tames and names the monsters of imagination, courts the unknown, reminds us of what we lose when we refuse to risk loss. Wedded to asymmetry, she discovers fearful symmetries that recur on the cellular level and in the scheme of a human life and the world writ large, each thread unspooling and cut on a planet that lives by spinning. Something in Linda Gregerson's work, her ethos, brings a parable of Kafka's to mind. Leopards break into the temple and drink the sacrificial chalices dry. This occurs repeatedly again and again. Finally, it can be reckoned upon beforehand. It becomes part of the ceremony. The maker of a poem must build a temple and allow or invite at least one leopard in, and must also refill the chalice. The ceremony of creation, with whatever rituals work for the writer, may be private. But the object created by one person's subjectivity is something we can share collectively, something that affirms the sanctity of our individual vulnerable lives. In an interview conducted with David Baker, who happens to be with us tonight, I didn't know he would be. Welcome, David, who, by the way, read for us at Hofstra University in April 2019 in person. Those were the days. David marveled at the transfigurations unfolding in the poem Prodigal, which is the title poem of Linda Gregerson's new and selected poems. David said, "I was simply not prepared for the complexity of this trope," referring to the closing of the poem. "Yet it felt, even on first reading, entirely right. How did this ending come about? Was it early or late in the process of composition when you determined how the poem should terminate?" And Linda replied, "It was very late. I was stuck for a long, long time. It's always the hardest and the truest part of composition for me, reaching a point where the poem needs to go more deeply into itself by going elsewhere, authentically elsewhere, somewhere I haven't pre-plotted. I often find that point by writing slightly beyond it, into a fulfillment that's too predictable. So I have to cut back to the precipice and be stranded there for a while. It's a very uncomfortable place. It drives me crazy. And it's where the thing either does or does not become a poem. Well, it often does. Here is Linda Gregerson. Welcome. It's an honor for you to be with us.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Thank you for that introduction, which was very moving and wonderful. I hope the reading doesn't disappoint after that. And thank you all for being here. I want especially to thank Phyllis's students for the conversation we had an hour or so ago. I was really, was exceedingly generous of you to read my work with this much attention. I will also call out David Baker, who's here, but just no longer live on the screen. David is one of my most important readers. I show him work when I'm putting together a book, and he is extraordinarily generous and astute with his comments. I don't remember now which book it was. It was one before Prodigal, and I showed him this and he said, fine, Linda, all this, harrowing stuff. Maybe you could just like write something maybe you could write a love poem once in a while. And so, I'm going to begin with a love poem. Love poem. Once, my very best darling, the sea and the land were all one mass, and the light was confused and hadn't found a place to rest. And Emma, love, my sister's eyes were not yet there to hold it all together, since she hadn't yet been born. And I imagine, though I never thought to ask them, I believe they must have been afraid. My own poor bid at being born, so nearly having killed her. Not my sister, no, our mother. Though I see, looking into your own dear eyes, that one, as a matter of course, entails the other, and I don't even think I can properly call it love. What I demanded, what I had in mind, I wanted something mine. And what you wish for, if the gods see fit to grant it, marks the limits of your soul. And though the years have scoured the worst of what made me unfit for the gift, if all I could think with you in my arms was taste of bile, the thousand ways of harming you, lest the world should do it for me, what's to become of me now she's gone? You said, because it has fallen on you to be my comfort, that's your daily job. You said, there's been science. The people in labs have done brain scans, and the thing we take for this I am about to do is really just the flash of the neurons in fear, which has evolved to keep us safe. I didn't keep her safe. My sister, love, my one and longed for only. First, I left her to the daily harms. I might have seen them coming, some of them, one of the worst in any case. And then, but that was different. Then the illness that had only left me bitten took her altogether in its jaws. I thought sometimes that she had turned away from me. I'm frightened for you till you do. And I'm going to read another poem called Love Poem, and you will think I've made a terrible mistake and I'm losing my mind, because you will think I'm just beginning the same poem again, but this becomes a different poem. This one is actually in 3 sections. Love Poem 1. Once, my very best darling, the sea and the land were all one mass, and the light was confused and hadn't found a place to rest. And Megan, love, my sister's eyes were not yet there to hold it all together, since she hadn't yet been born. So when the world dropped out from under us, and no one, not the on-calls with their CAT scans, not the sovereign souls who monitor the twilight room where newborns come to die or live, when no one could tell us if you would be one of the lucky ones able to walk and speak, and only this, the one unstinted blessing fate had given us to give you, was a sister in whose eyes you were the sun and moon. It meant we all, no matter what befell us, all had solid ground. Pity the part we think we do on purpose. 2. When Karen was dying, and books had shut their doors to her. She could still make out the puzzle of knit and purl. I'm keeping it simple, she said, although the pattern emerging beneath her fine hands did not look simple to me. An A, a B, an alphabet, and all in the single color, milk. The letters distinguished by only the altered stitchwork, so the nursery would be beautiful. Whichever of the children has a baby first, she said. She loved the future, no matter she wouldn't be here. 3. Second born. As fateful as the transit to light and air, or so you've often tried to teach me, I will never properly understand. But I know how the hair at your temples curls in summer when the air is moist, as if she'd been returned to me. I must have had some under the radar notion even then when we were children, how that little looseness threw my petty masteries in the shade. And so the joy of it was lost on me. Till you. I'm the only person living who remembers her childhood curls. We were talking an hour ago, the students and I, about how poems evolve, how once you're in them, how you find your way. And once in a while, it's actually words themselves that come to rescue you. This next poem was very, very uncertain of how it ought to end. And etymology did it for me. So as you'll hear, and the etymology then helped me choose the title, which is Deciduous. Speak plainly, said November to the maples. Say what you mean now that summer's lush declensions lie like the lies they were at your feet. Haven't we praised you? Haven't we summer after summer put our faith in augmentation? But look at these leavings of not enough light. It's time for sterner counsel now. It's time. We know you're good at this. We've seen the way your branched articulations keep faith with the whole. It's time to call us back to order before we altogether lose our way. Speak brightly, said the cold months. Speak with a mouth of snow. The scaffolding is clear now. We thank you. The moon can measure its course by you. Instruct us while the divisions of light are starkest, before the murmurs of consolation resume. Instruct us in the harder course of mindfulness. Speak truly, said April. Not just what you think we're hoping to hear. Speak so we believe you. The child who learned perspective from the stand of you, near and nearer, knowing you were permanent, is counting the years to extinction now. Teach her to teach us the disciplines of do less harm. We're capable of learning. We've glimpsed the bright intelligence that courses through the body that contains us. De sedare, say the maples, has another face. it also means decide. Phyllis, I was both deeply honored and horrified to hear you talk about Milton. I thought, I used to say that the great advantage of working on Milton as a scholar is that there was no danger of trying to sound like him and letting that infect what I hope is authentically contemporary American verse. This next poem actually began, I suppose I painted myself in a corner now, I've got to confess it. It began as a commission by the Milton Society of America. They have an annual dinner and they commission a poem. Anyway, I thought, oh my God, my worst nightmare. This is really not good here. But there is a piece of very small, I had to sort of keep him under house arrest. There's a tiny touch of direct citation later on from Paradise Lost, but I needed some defense against Milton and that spectacular language and that spectacular imagination. And so this poem is in some ways a sort of double ekphrastic. It's got Paradise Lost in mind, but it's also describing and responding to a series of paintings by a remarkable American artist named Tom Utek. He lives in Wisconsin. He lives and works in the North Woods. These are the woodlands of the Precambrian Shield, northern Wisconsin, southern Ontario, and he does a lot of his work actually out in the woods. But the canvases themselves are, they feel mythical. They're assemblages of creatures of the woodland, and they're often overfilling the canvas and sometimes staring directly at us, the viewers, in a way that's very disconcerting, and sometimes moving, and all in one direction. They're very troubling canvases, so I liked them. The title of this poem, and this is also in 3 sections. It's called Not So Much an End as an Entangling. Not so much an end as an entangling. 1. And then the animals began to flee from right to left across the surface of the visual plane. The birds in great number, owl and osprey, red-necked grebe, the nuthatch, the nighthawk, the warbler in 11 kinds. And that's when we began to understand, because it wasn't normal, wasn't what you expect to find, the eaters and the likely to be eaten in a single frame. Despised the ground, our poet says, intelligent of seasons. And the 6th day, too, when creatures of the earth began to walk the earth, proposes a thoughtscape of nothing needs to die that I might live. But that was then. And in the painting, it is more like now. Desiccated needles on a desiccated branch. If creation with pinions appears to fly below as well as in the sky, that's simply a trick of vantage point, the better to accommodate the interlocking logic of the whole, as when eternity is broken into pieces we construe as plot. So timber wolf and white-tailed deer and indigo bunting below, which is to say between perspective having turned the three dimensions into two, all of them fleeing right to left, as from, since they who are intelligent of seasons are the first to know, from imminent disaster, which has made the lesser enmities moot. 2. When I was a child, it was the numbers I couldn't get out of my head. So many billions, so little time to make it stop. A single patch of ground, say, just from here to the wall. How many of us, if we took turns lying down, could fit? I didn't think water or waste or work. I just thought how many standing and how many minutes the others would get to rest. Only later did the obvious answer occur to me. I won't be here. And then the panic would stop. But have 3. I now seen death, he wondered. And the angel said, you've scarcely seen its shadow. Look, the winged ones, furred ones, fleeing from right to left, as from the names that you in all your fond first powers bestowed. There was water in the reed beds. Think of it, water still. The sun still rose. The snail foot exuded its mucus. And then the angel pulled, just slightly. On one of the threads composing the linen, the painter had tacked to his stretcher. What is it you love that has not been ruined because of you? Have I now seen death is what Adam asks in the 11th book of Paradise Lost when he's being shown the Cain and Abel enactment. He's being shown a brother murdering a brother. And it occurs to them that to Adam, that this is that thing he's always heard about, but little does he know. This next poem is called Narrow Flame. My family and I were lucky enough to include in our family a really remarkable horse for a number of years. Donovan was half Connemara and half thoroughbred, and was a miracle of a creature. One of the great tragedies in our lives with the animals we often domesticate is that our lifespans don't equal one another, they're incommensurate. And so the mourning that's built in to the life we live is hastened. Narrow flame. Sun at the zenith, greening earth. Slight buckling of the left hind leg. And all this while, the girl at his ear, good boy. And now the hip giving way, and mildly, as was ever his wont, the lovely heft of him lists toward the field that minutes ago was still so sweet for grazing, and good boy. And on the ground now, where the frightening last shudder of lungs that we've been warned about does thank you, darling, does not come. and feeling for a pulse, no pulse, and warning us, touching the liquid eye, which does not close, which means the slender needle with its toxic everlastingness has done its job. Good boy. Unbuckling the halter, lifting the beautiful head to her lap, and all this while, the girl. I gotta check our time. I'm gonna read 3 more poems. Just gonna do it. This is called Archival. If the curator should wish, for example, to save for later scrutiny, or wonder's worthy too, a once ubiquitous download for dispersing the forces of Christendom, or evading the enemy's landmines, or colonizing Mars, and if, as is all but certain, the program depends on software run by hardware no longer extant. If reconstructions work too well, eliding the awkward temporal gap between keystroke and pixelated body count, how will they know what it's like to be us? If even the ditches along our abandoned railroad spurs have long succumbed to never any water, how will they know what we mean by July, when the cornflowers first appear, when gladly the parched eye quenches its thirst in blue? For Providence, in lieu of the kind we used to think we trusted in, we built a global seed vault on an island in the Arctic Sea. There were rules. The seeds aren't owned, but stored. And only the donors of origin have access. That will teach them something too. So maize and eggplant, lotus root, and cabbage in potentia for the world to come. Assuming survival of people who remember what seeds are for, and something that passes for topsoil. Permafrost, 500 meters at present, and sleeping tectonics below. Site well above what's likely to be a flood zone when the ice caps melt. It must have helped with costs a bit to build the vault where once we mined for coal. They'll credit us with irony. I'm speaking to you from Michigan. Things are bad all over these United States and disunited all over these United States. Michigan has some particularities about it. You may have, for example, read about a plot to kidnap and try and execute our governor because she dared to require that we wear face masks in certain public spaces. This poem is called If the Cure for AIDS. It's not a long poem. If the cure for AIDS, said someone in that earlier pandemic, were a glass of clean water, we couldn't save half the people here. If half the workers at Tyson Meats come down with the virus, we still have a plan for protecting the owners from lawsuits. If the phone in the farmhouse rings when it's long past dark and the milk, if the tanks in the co-op are full, If milk dumped into a culvert makes you think of death. My neighbor drove to Lansing in his pickup. I expect you've seen the photos too. The State House floor, the rifles. He had just culled half his herd. And while we're casting about for ways to summon normal, I've been watching footage of the day-old chicks. 116,000 buried alive. It seems we can't afford the feed, or can't afford the falling price of chicken. I'm mostly confused by the articles meant to explain. Look at the spill of them. Dump truck into the pre-dug ditch. The mewling, yellow spill of them, still in the down we find adorable. Red earth, impassive skyscape, skittering bits of agitation on the body of the whole. And a final poem. I'm not a person used to domesticated animals because I'm an asthmatic and I'm allergic basically to all things living. It's really, so I couldn't grow up with other creatures. So things that like the rest of the world has known and taken for granted is like revelation to me. Anyway, there is now a dog in my life for the duration of the pandemic, and blessedly, my medicines and his general hypoallergenic fur keep us happy together. He is currently training to be certified for search and rescue, and though I certainly don't go off on these training gigs with him, my daughter does, and boy, am I learning a lot. That's one context. There is in Basel a remarkable painting by Hans Holbein of Christ entombed. It's one that's much reproduced. It's highly elongated. That is, it's not naturalistic in that sense. The dimensions are off. If that body, the canvas itself, well, it's actually on lime wood. It's a wooden panel, but it's not a regular rectangle. It's very elongated, as is the body rendered. If that dead man were to rise and stand, he would be well over 7 feet tall. It's an extraordinary painting, and the second two sections of this poem are very much about that painting. When nothing but tree. When nothing but tree can be seen in the tree, though the dogs unmistakably indicate. When clearly the canopy calls to them, and days have passed before you've even begun. When nothing in the undergrowth has prompted so much as a whimper, you must turn your thoughts to the other bank. Scent from a living body will be carried on the wind. Scent from a corpse in the river spreads like oil. But say the return to elements has started just beyond that rise. The body is cold. The scent, like a river, seeks lowest ground, becoming part of the river itself, which the trees in turn imbibe, and drawing upward, change to living green. The one you seek is now an exhalation, as the dogs, intelligent beyond our wildest reckoning, have told us have been telling us. In Basel, on a panel made of lime wood, emphatically unrisen, the body of Christ lies in its frame as in a coffin, thwarted verticals, and strung along a fault line where the pigment in egg yolk old way meets the pigment in linseed new, the flesh breathes beauty as only that which is liable to perish can breathe. The green going black of face, of feet, a visible hand confirm no going back to what you were. How is it the linen on which he lies so clearly discloses the palette of stone, and hence the catalogue title, Entombed, which means the coffin I've imagined, warmer frame wood, must be pity's crafted afterthought, or argument, the wholly this world, begging to differ with all we've been taught to hope for. (1521). The heretic from Wittenberg refuses to recant, though the question has not yet turned to presence or real. Sit down at my table, my body, my blood, and I, on your behalf, will paint a picture. Note the gaping nostril, gaping mouth, the other mouth of the wound in his side, the cradle of the abdomen. You see how disproportionate I've made his length, the better to seal credulity. It's 1521. It is known, writes my informant, that the artist used a body retrieved from the Rhine, citation needed. And either the fish had not eaten the open eye, or Holbein in his studio restored it. Never elsewhere, says the lime wood, never blind. Behold the nearer case for mystery. I'm here to praise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. We are here to praise you and clap for you. Thank you so much. I know there will be some questions. You may, anyone who would like to speak has to remember to unmute themselves. And thank you so much, Linda.
My pleasure.
And Carol, you might help me if there's anyone asking a question by chat. Some people might prefer asking, but it might be easiest. Carol, you'll help me with the hand raising. I'm not seeing that. Oh, maybe, oh, I see, in participants.
Yes, I'll help you.
Thank you. It would help, yes, if you call on people, because I'm not seeing the hands, and I think you are.
We're waiting for hands to be raised. So maybe you'd like to ask the first question.
I saw three actually, and the first one was Paige Starzingers.
Oh, Paige, please.
Oh, I don't.
Paige, did you have a question?
Sorry, no, I was just clapping.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Maybe clapping is a kind of question.
Yeah, you can just raise your hand in the chat if you hover in the participants, if you hover over your name.
I don't see any hands.
Stunned silence.
Pardon?
You have a question.
I know that people have questions, so.
Well, perhaps what you can do then is turn your video on and raise your hand like that.
Yeah, we know David Baker has a question, so let's start with David. And I'm looking at the chat room. David, would you ask the question, please?
Sure. I think you can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Oh, there I am. Sure. If there. Hi, Linda.
Hi.
I have. I was writing notes like crazy, and I'm trying to read my notes, writing down phrases. Never elsewhere. Delicious. Speak plainly. That little lesson in the decisive trees, the deciduous leaves. I loved that. But my question is much more simple here. You were reading a poem that began, one of the last poems, with a long run of delicious if clauses. The poem that took place in Michigan.
Oh, Archival. Yeah.
That's the name of, that was my question. What was the name of that?
Archival.
Archival. And my second question is greedy. You are frustratingly slow to give us your books. And you read so many new poems tonight. I'm imagining there's a manuscript there. Is that right?
Almost. I'm hoping, I'm thinking turn of the year. I want to send it. Well, I always need your input, but to send it to my editor.
That's terrific.
That's what I'm hoping. Yeah, I hope 2-3 months, maybe. That doesn't mean but the book will be a whole other year.
You're done.
Yeah,
As is the case.
it will. And it was delicious to hear the love poems. More
Thank
than
you.
one. I'll have to contrive another.
I've got you on my shoulder.
Well, I'll be quiet here and let people ask questions.
So I'm just thinking, Jessica Bjork, are you there? Do you have another question, Jessica? Jessica, did you want to ask anything else? For some reason, the hand raising function is not working. So I have no idea who would like to say something. And
Paige would like to say something.
okay, Paige, please.
I actually wasn't, but I just want to say how incredible that reading was. And Linda, thank you so much. And also the new poems. So looking forward to your book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, Ayinda, you're here. Ayinda. I haven't seen you in a while. Ayinda, do you have a question?
Excuse me, Gio has a question first.
Oh,
He had
sorry.
his hand raised.
Yes, can you hear me perfectly?
Gio, I can't hear you very well.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Hello?
Better.
You hear me?
That's
Yeah,
better.
I don't know if you answered this question before, but I was wondering if you have like a book out, because I'm interested in like reading of the following poems or stories that you have out there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I have, I mean, David asked about whether there was going to be a book forthcoming, and he is right. I write very slowly. I have 6 books of poems, and most of them are still available one way or another. The most recent one is Prodigal, and it's a new and selected, so it's a gathering of poems from my previous books, as well as a series of 20 poems that were new at the time. Thank you for asking. Prodigal. Yeah.
Prodigal. Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Paige? Is Paige up next, I believe?
I-
Or no?
No, I'm not sure why I keep coming.
I don't know.
Just absorbing Linda's poem.
Carol, I'm going to have to depend on you because I have
Yes.
no.
Ayinde had a question. I thought.
I do.
Thank you. Ayinda, hello.
Hello. Over the course of your poems, I was, I think, most entranced by the fact that you mix classic influences with modern day current events and a reference. When it comes to finding something to befit the message you want to put into a poem, how do you decide what kind of analogy or reference you want to make?
Thank you for asking that question, and for also, noticing that the mix of things. I try to be eclectic that way. I want my poems to welcome in all kinds of stuff, whether it's, you know, reading the classics or what I heard, you know, while I was standing in line at the grocery store this morning. I don't write poems in order to convey a message. So that's one. I mean, maybe that wasn't entirely what you meant, but I don't bring things in from the outside in order to serve a purpose I already have, which is to say, I was talking about this with some students earlier this afternoon. I might start almost anywhere, and it might be with, say, a commission from the Milton Society, or a painting that I think is scary, or a piece of something from the morning paper. And I try to capture what that's prompted in me. But I don't, to my mind, part of the good faith process of making a poem is that a poem at some level has to be a mode of inquiry. It has to be questioning. I have to be, after trying to find out something I don't know. And lots of times I don't even know what I don't know. I know there's some attachment or some urgency. I have a launch. And then I've got to find my way. And it's really like finding my way in the dark. And so it's, rather than bringing things in, it's trying to be alert enough, kind of focused. And you know, that can include focused on very mechanical things, focused on a particular metric or particular set of sounds I want to hear, or often for me, a shape of syntax, a shape, the way the sentence is going, or it could be description of something, but focus that is also, that allows for some drift, so that I'm open to things insisting from the outside on coming into the poem. So that's how I experience it, rather than reaching for things that I then want to add. Sometimes I will feel strongly that, especially if I've allowed myself to write a fairly complex sentence, where, you know, the syntax is hypotactic, I might think, okay, you need something shorter, you need something more idiomatic. I might have a feel that I need a shift in tone to sort of stay on board, but it's not really reaching for things. It's more intuitive than that, I guess, is my answer. More intuitive. Thanks for the question.
Is Danielle, I think, is here, or Hunter? Do either of you have a question?
Natalie seems to have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, since you've written books of poems, I was wondering how you know, and you probably have a lot of people read them, or your group of people that in your circle that read them. How do you know when to walk away from a poem when you know it's finished, or it conveys the message that you're trying to get across? Because things can be interpreted differently from everyone who reads it.
If you're talking about individual poems, knowing when they're done or need abandoning, I don't usually show poems to readers, and not at this point in my writing life, when I don't have a pretty settled sense of what it is meant to be, of where it that it's come to something. I guess, again, I don't mean to sound too sort of wafty, and and stereotypical that way, but there's something also kind of intuitive about it, because I believe so strongly that poems, to be real poems, need to be kind of at risk, need to be looking to discover something they don't know when you start them. As a writer, for me, a poem can't end until there's been some sort of discovery, some sort of yield, some sort of something that wasn't pre-plotted or wasn't just a working out of a dynamic or a momentum with which I began. So, but now that doesn't necessarily mean the poem has actually come to an end. It means that it's promising to be a poem, and that I can, that it's come to, and I sometimes that is the end. Sometimes it's just, that's where it lands. And sometimes it needs some other move. And often I find what it needs is something that spares the poem the sense of resonant conclusion. That is, I don't want it to be portentous that way. So, and it doesn't mean just something offhand or any old offhand thing, something that's going to be resonant, but that doesn't, but not climactic, not with a lot of sort of fanfare.
Thank you.
I had a question, but I'd rather a student who hasn't spoken yet speak first. So Carol, do you see anyone else who has a hand raised?
I do not.
So continuing, Linda, with this, I think one of the most central concerns of the process of writing a poem, that one must be in the dark, not know where one's going in order to feel one is going somewhere true. I know that in that same interview that David Baker conducted with you, I think when Magnetic North was coming out, you talked about not being able to write the poem without a provisional shape for the stanza. Those were your words, a provisional shape for the stanza. Now I connect to this very strongly because I think that has to do with being in the dark, but I'm just wondering about that. That is, having a shape, not being able to go on without the shape, paradoxically can allow one to go where into the unknown, because one has a focus on something that's not topical. But I'm wondering if that's how it works for you, because I know that's how it works for me. I'm just wondering if you could address that.
Hugely. It's just, it's like, I mean, I guess it's like having walking sticks or having a guide dog or having, I don't know what the best metaphor is, but no, that's absolutely true. I really lean on that set of instructions. One of the things is it gives me some sort of honest, homely work to do. I've got a sort of set of expectations I've posited out there. This has to be a long line, the next one has to be a short one and indented and so forth. And it's like, I don't know, it's like doing dishes or sort of doing the laundry or something. It's ordinary quotidian sort of work. It's sort of this foot in front of that foot in front of that foot in front of that foot. And the humbleness of it is very enabling.
Because there's that labor and one is concentrated on the labor.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's this world out there one doesn't have control of, but at the same time, one can then go into the zone and things come to the surface that one could never conjure consciously.
Right. It's nuts and bolts. It's really great. It's a sort of focused, well, I'm overusing this word, but it's a kind of disciplined mental wandering So there's structure. So there's structure.
Oh, thank you. That's revelatory, I think, because I've noticed that my students who imitated that triadic line that I know you, to a large degree, perhaps have abandoned because you said you worked in it for about 20 years, but you wanted to do something else with that, open first and last line of each tercet being quite long, and then the middle being sometimes only a foot long. Talk about 1 foot in front of the other. But that pattern allowed you to forget yourself. And I noticed that I have students, I asked them to try to simulate that pattern, and they wrote things they never would have written before.
Wow.
And acknowledge that. And I think it does have something to do with, they got your walking sticks. They worked. They were able to go to a mountain they wouldn't have before.
I will also do that, have students mimic form. And one of the ones, and people have been doing it all over the country, is Jericho Brown's duplex form.
Oh, yeah.
And it was so useful for my students. I mean, ones that they were just, it just changed everything for them, because it's for those of you who may not know it, it's a sort of tipping of the hat to sonnets, but it's a series of 7 couplets, hence duplex, and various strategies of repetition, phrasal repetition. And it's just amazing how much just taking somebody else's, borrowing it and thinking, I guess what does it feel like to think in this body? What does it feel like to walk in these boots?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Phoebe, did you have another question?
Sure. Where am I? There I am. Hi. So I guess if you could speak a little more about your actual process. So, because your form is very meticulous. So I'm curious, which comes first? The egg or the chicken? Do you come out with this is I'm just gonna get it all out and then you play with form, or do you specifically have in mind, I want to do this in this type of format?
Neither. What I do is I've got some, I've got something I'm starting with, and there is a point. I still, it's so primitive. I know for younger people this will seem absolutely prehistoric, but I still have a phase where I work in pencil on a yellow legal pad.
Mm-hmm.
and I it's just, and I might, anyway, it's just all kinds of starts and false starts and garbage. Whether I'm, there may be a narrative I'm invested in, or it may be a descriptive effort, or it may be a piece of language I just stole, from somebody. And I play for a very, very long time while it's still really inchoate. Both the words and the form are inchoate. And then when I start getting more language, that's when I start playing with stanza structure. I have to do that early. It's when I have what might be, it might be as little as 2 lines, it might be a bit more, not more than 5 lines worth. And it's like playing in a sandbox. I mess around. And then once I've found that, and I've found the way I can, and that may force me to change what I thought, or say that what I thought was the first sentence or something, because it turns out it's not quite working. So I have to do a lot of adjustment very, very early. It's a very sort of extended early stage with a lot of mess. Then I can write forward. and I'm writing into that stanza structure, into that form. Does that mean it goes fluidly? No, but it means I've got something to hold on to. Yeah, it means I've got handhold or foothold or whatever. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Great.
We have a question now from Nikon.
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. Your work has been wonderful. So my question is, in reading your poem Pythagorean, you have a very special way of conveying a message that is very geometrical almost. And when I think of a shape, it's that structure, but it also has a void inside of it and outside of it. So do you think that a poem should replicate things that are, I guess, ideal shapes or forms in the world? Or how do you, kind of go about that?
That is a brilliant question and a brilliant suggestion. And that's not what I do. But I'm thrilled you found some of that. Of course, Pythagoras is, school children, I, as a school child anyway, first encountered him because of geometry. That was a persona poem, also one of it, that series of persona poems I wrote based on tales from in the Metamorphoses. I think, a poet I know who does think, I think, more conceptually about geometric structure and ideal shapes, maybe not always, but who has experimented with that, I think, brilliantly, is Alice Fulton. Mm-hmm. And when she was my colleague here at Michigan and teaching, I know she gave her students an assignment about, it's called the golden ratio, isn't it? Yeah. And it's both a mathematical formula, but it's also, as it turns, it's discovered in nature. It's this, and it's, and she and her students generated really extraordinary poems based, and that was a spatial concept with which they began. I remember one poet whose work was just kind of transformed. He was from Wisconsin, and he was from farm country, and he was writing, about fields that way, but using this actually highly abstract and mathematical concept to move forward. It was just transformative. It was really thrilling. So I hope you're doing it, and I hope I can read your work and learn how to do it from you.
Well, Christopher, when I remember that in our class about a week ago, or was it 2 weeks ago, you actually discovered you thought that structure was enacted in this poem, from what I remember, no?
Yes, yes.
You want to talk about it a little?
Oh, for sure. So I typically am someone who likes to find the meaning in things, and sometimes I tend to believe poems should have some sort of utilitarian purpose. As someone who studies medieval manuscripts and things, they often had a utilitarian purpose or a reason they would write verse down. It was more than to express feeling or something within. And in my reading of Pythagorean, there was such beautiful use that came of it, in the sense that I was able to see that very haunting line, the voice of my friend in the dog. And that was something that I don't know necessarily the specific reason why that is so haunting or why that stuck with me. But I think that Linda, your poem really stuck with me in that way where it's able to gauge a reader's response and have them mimic it in their own work. So it's almost like a meme tradition of some kind. And, you know, so it was a very beautiful experience to read your poem.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that reading. I'm very, very grateful.
Ashanti, did you want to ask a question? If you're still here, I think you are.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. So earlier in the discussion before this, you mentioned this idea of an elsewhere. And I noticed in some of your poems, you have this shift where the poem changes its subject, not necessarily on a more nuanced level, but on a higher level. So I wondered if you could speak more on this idea of elsewhere and the importance of it in your work.
Thank you, Ashanti. It may be most conspicuous in some of the poems I've written in sections where, well, I guess one example would be if you've been reading in Prodigal, the poem called the Selvage, which begins with this a sort of persona speaking about canvassing for an election. And then the second section follows on that in a certain predictable, or at least, you know, a legible way, because I wrote that first section and thought, oh man, great, I wrote a short poem for a change. And then morning after, I thought, no, it looks way too smug. You can't leave it here, Linda. So in that sense, the second section then was, it's more my voice and correcting for smugness, frankly, self-satisfaction in that earlier section. But that was not enough. I knew it couldn't just be point counterpoint, because that in itself would be a sort of, aren't I great? I've called myself out on my own errors, and here's the correct version. So it needed a third. And I was super stuck. I mean, I was stuck forever, weeks. I mean, it was just awful. And it really, I knew I needed an elsewhere, but by definition, I didn't know what that was. And it was only when I was driving home, and the third section begins with this basically visitation of migrant geese, that, and I didn't know how that fit at all. Because if I did know, it would have been pre-plotted and it wouldn't have been authentically elsewhere. I just knew that that was something that really struck me deeply, and I had to give it a try. And so as I worked on that third section, I discovered, you know, that the poem was really thinking about us and them. It was, you know, the canvassing in question was about canvassing for Obama during the time he was first running for office. It was, and it was judgmental about a certain kind of voter whom it was representing, and it was telling a story at the expense of a certain kind of voter. And so the second section, which again was from experiential, which was more predictable, I was talking about a more personal, something that actually was particular to me and a family member, about inside and outside, and living on the other side of condescension, being the recipient of it. But all along, I realized as I was trying to then figure out what these geese had to do with anything, I realized I was trying to write about, at some level, American democracy, you know, about what makes us, what makes us a collective, and what endangers that collective. And these, you know, it was a period when we were doing, because I was writing this much after the fact, I wasn't writing it during the Obama election time, where migrants were very much in the news, and mainly our keeping them out was in the news. And I realized that those geese, they were starting to seem to me to be saying, to just be something, not saying something about, but to be something about collectives and how collectives work. And so as I described the way, you know, in a really adverse season, I was worried for them. I'd worried they'd kind of gotten stuck here because the seasons have gotten so confusing, and they hadn't gone far enough south fast enough because the river was freezing over and they were on it. And it was very windy. It was really brutal weather. But the way they held formation on the water was that they took turns taking the full force of the river and the wind, and that it was the geese then who gave me the title of that poem, The Selvage, which is about that selvage is that part of a fabric that is bound in a certain unravel. And so really those geese gave me the whole poem. And I just, you know, I had to wait for them. I had to wait for them.
That's like, in some way, that is the unknown, something coming from elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, the analogy in the olden days would be grace. It's as if grace enters the poem, one had to be open to it.
I always think that's what folks used to mean by saying the muse.
Yes, yes, yeah. And it is something other, and it's, I mean, that leads to my question about the metamorphosis, how the metamorphosis, because I know in recent years, there's been a greater understanding of Ovid's metamorphosis also coming out of a political climate of great instability.
Yeah.
And that these humans being transformed into other forms isn't just a punishment for a transgression, but the very act of being who they are does transform them. I haven't figured it out, and I don't know that there is a way to figure it out, but I'm curious about your attraction to these figures, meaning Arachne in the Weavers, which has the historic, the epic simile. It's not the as when, but it's the as and then the so, these two, you know, these two, the girl and the goddess.
Yeah.
Which again is probably one of the reasons I think of Milton, because of the way you create vast spaces. I mean, I think of, you know, Lucifer just falling and falling and falling, meaning there's there's a huge experience of space that opened up. It was partly because, you know, Galileo's telescope, right? Milton looked through that telescope. So that sense of the vastness of the universe, when the earth is not the center. So I feel as if your poetry is haunted by these Pascalian spaces. And that maybe that's somehow connected to Ovid, but I don't know. I'm just wondering if you thought about it, or whether you just were attracted, like magnetic filings, to these different myths and just felt compelled.
Well, I try to think about Ovid in coherent and sometimes discursive fashion. And I love, and by the way, my Latin is, insofar as it ever existed, is non-existent now. So I'm reading Ovid in English. I mean, it's quite pathetic. But although he's so glorious that, that survives translation with the vitality it does. But also, because I spend large part of my life with these Renaissance authors, and Ovid was just omnipresent in that culture. It was omnipresent in their elementary education. He was just everywhere. But I was rereading Ovid. This is another confession. Just like having to write a poem on assignment for the Milton Society, I had been asked to do a paper for MLA on an Ovid panel, no, on a classical reception panel. And so I was rereading and rereading Ovid, and feeling very torn because I had this paper I wrote and gave, but I was thinking, oh my God, this stuff is so gorgeous. I wish I could just steal it for poems. And then it was like light switch going on. I thought, I can just do both. I'll just plunder him in both directions. And the more time I spend with the Metamorphoses, the more extraordinary it seems on every level, absolutely every level. As you say, political, but it's also, I've been thinking about it, as many have, in terms of climate and environmental thinking. Well, that's that scale of thinking about a radically independent, a radically dependent, interdependent cosmos. And so even the parts where, and I guess I've used it in other work, not in poems lately, but in the very beginning of the Metamorphoses, when he's talking about the creation of the world, it's really quite extraordinary how that is built. And of course, he's anthologizing a rich inheritance of stories and fables and tropes. And then with this, extraordinary poetry and imagination for particularity, but also with, speaking of structure, this brilliant nesting structure of story within story within story. It makes it all, it never ends, because you think you've thought and thought and thought from all angles about a particular famous story, and then you realize, oh my God, but in the Metamorphoses, look who's telling that story, and look at whom they're telling it, to whom they're telling it, and it completely reshuffles the meaning. It's just, it's really quite endlessly rich.
Well, speaking of endlessly rich, the fecundity of the imagination and Ovid, I don't know if there is one more question, but if we only have a moment for one more question, if there is one. Who would like to ask a question? Don't think of it as the final question, but as because the questions will never end. But in this continuum, who would like to ask a question? This is your chance, please. You could just start speaking, because I won't know that you have a question to ask. Maybe Carol will. Is there someone? Taylor or Amelia? Anyone? Tammy? Tammy, you haven't asked anything yet.
Does Taylor have a question?
Yeah, I can ask a question. So, what is it that makes you wake up every day and want to keep writing? What drives you to keep seeing the world from a refreshing lens?
Well, I should confess that in my old age, the way I wake up in the world is to lose myself in the newspaper for a while, coffee and the newspaper. And I turn, oh, that's not entirely true. That's not entirely true. Sometimes I'm really so in the thick of, in the middle of a problem in a poem, middle of a moment. And so it's been haunting my sleep, and I got to wake up and go immediately back to that and see if I can catch something. But I guess, you know, for the really profound question that you're asking, Taylor. I'm so keenly aware of how short my time on earth is, how very, very, very short this is. That I don't want to have come to the end and had it all be lost on me. So I know that what I can try to be cognizant of is a tiny, tiny fraction. I mean, a tiny, fleeting little bit of it. But I don't want to have missed that chance. And poetry is the way I try to have it not be lost on me.
Well, thank you very much for everything you've done. I can speak on behalf of the students and say that we're all very inspired and we've really enjoyed reading your work and then getting the treat of listening to you talk about your work and your life. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you all for being part of this. It means the world, and you know, this is against oblivion, and this in itself is a memorable evening. The poems on the page we will always remember, but also we can't forget, you know, really meeting you this way, hearing you, and your generosity to everyone who had a question, and just these incredible poems that you read. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all.